Well, hello and welcome to this special webinar with the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. I'm joining you today from Wurundjeri country here in Victoria, and I acknowledge the continuing role of Indigenous people in caring for country. I make my own commitment to care for this special place, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Amy House. I am the AWC Chief Development Officer, and it's my job to make sure that AWC raises the funds it needs to deliver our critical conservation program across Australia. It's also my job to ensure that AWC remains accountable to you, our supporters, and to ensure that we constantly demonstrate the impact of your investment in wildlife. Well, what better illustration of impact for wildlife conservation than that special moment when we are able to build back up or even completely reintroduce populations of native animals where they belong in protected habitat. Thanks to your support, AWC continues to deliver Australia's most ambitious and most successful species reintroductions and translocations program. And that is what brings us to this webinar today. That program does not happen in isolation. It takes years of scientific research, monitoring and planning, and equally years of active land management conservation before those precious animals can be brought back into those habitats. It takes ongoing, consistent, innovative management to ensure that the relentless threats to wildlife and habitat remain at bay. And those threats are relentless. 130 species added to the threatened species list in 23 alone. It means the work of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy has never been more critical. Today, I'm going to pass over to you, to our CEO, Tim Allard. He's going to talk about that context, the broader strategic work and the landscape scale program that underpins our reintroduction strategy. Then you'll hear from Senior Ecologist Dr. Jen Anson and Senior Science Communicator Joey Clarke, and they're going to share some case studies from the field to demonstrate how AWC is literally bringing species back from the brink of extinction. So let's begin that conversation. I'm going to pass you over to Tim. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm in Perth, and we've been through essentially 12 months of fairly significant drought conditions. And I know there's a few Perth people and Western Australian people on the call today. And we've all seen the dire circumstances where some of the Jarrah forest is declining through the lack of water. Yeah, happily, we're now in a period where we're getting a couple of weeks of rain, but it really paints a pretty stark picture as what's going on. As dire as that is the outcome of the federal budget that we had a couple of weeks ago. And for those who pay attention to these things, it was essentially a bad budget for nature. There was a continued decline and contraction in funding for the environment. In fact, the spend on biodiversity inside the federal budget is about $492 million, representing it's less than 0.1% of the total budget is spent on biodiversity. The total environment budget at a federal level has only grown 2% over the last 10 years, despite the economy growing on average 2.6% year on year. So in real terms, the environmental allocations are contracting. So that's a fairly important point, particularly, I'm going to keep my rant short, and I'll hand over to Jen and Joey as a star of the show today. But today, this year, 2024, is 10 years since Martin Copley passed away. And I think it's a pretty good signal, as Amy said before, that Martin's vision and his legacy and what we're responsible for now taking into the future is more important now than it was 10 years ago, and is more important now than it was 32 years ago when Martin first established AWC. We've got species in decline. 130 species were added to the list over the last 12 months. So it's it's pretty dire circumstances, but really the point of today is to recognise what your support has allowed us to achieve. So what AWC has been able to achieve. And you've all been to various AWC presentations and functions. You'll have seen us put the map on the wall. And when we talk about the map and the scale of AWC, it really underpins our ability to have a national perspective on ecological health, to undertake our rewilding programs at a national continental scale. And we're going to talk a little bit more detail about the rewilding, translocations, reintroductions today, but just to pause on why do we do those rewilding projects? Well, there's the starting point is saving species from going extinct. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about the northern bettong up in Queensland, the woylies, bilbies, numbats, red-tailed phascales. We have to do this interventionist work to save these species, to prevent further declines from letting them wink into extinction. These little animals that we rewild across the country, you've probably all heard the term of the ecosystem engineers, where they forage in the ground, they till over the soil, they help restore ecosystem function. They help mitigate the impact of a changing climate. When we're rewilding, conserving the land, we're retaining vegetation, improving the quality of the system. We're helping to mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. And it helps educate the community. And one of my key points, I made a public statement a couple of weeks ago after the budget that when I talk about the outcome of the budget, I'm not criticising government per se. What I'm recognising, what I'm pointing out is politicians respond to social norms, social pressures and policies of the day, or politics of the day. And clearly as a society, we're not yet valuing nature and our biodiversity well enough. And so when we can do our rewilding projects, where we can do the little project where you roll down the bag and the bilby pops his head out of the bag to have a look around and his little glistening eyes, and he jumps away, and we create footage of that, and we bring kids from the local communities in, we're helping to engage and educate people as to what's at risk of being lost. And when we can do that, when we can bring the community along, when we can bring society along with what we're doing, we'll start to put pressure back on government to improve regulation, policy, legislation, and we'll start to improve what's happening from a budgetary allocations. So despite that, despite what government has or hasn't been doing, AWC has succeeded and continues to succeed, and it's only done through the support you provide. So I'm going to go quiet now. I'll hand over to Joey and Jen, and thank you very much. And as Amy said, any questions, happy to answer at the end. Thanks, Joey and Jen.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Amy, too, for your introduction. I'm Joey, Senior Science Communicator, and today I'm in Melbourne as well, speaking to you from Wurundjeri country. You've all heard the story before. Australia's biodiversity is incredibly rich. We're one of the most diverse countries in the world when it comes to wildlife. But across many of our landscapes, there are species missing. In most parts of Australia, the small and medium-sized mammals have been wiped out, or their populations have been severely reduced. Some have gone extinct, but others have managed to cling on in tiny refuges like offshore islands or patches of bush where cats and foxes haven't made it, or they've got a bit more protection. AWC's translocation program is an attempt to turn the situation around, as Amy said, to restore healthy populations of some of these threatened species into our sanctuaries in order to stave off any further extinctions. There are 24 mammal species currently involved in this translocation program, with animals being released across 11 different sites. We've carried out hundreds of individual operations to do this work. So today, in conversation with Jen, I'd like to share some of the recent highlights from this work, which are quite literally stopping extinctions. So to introduce Dr. Jennifer Anson, Jen is a senior ecologist on AWC's national science team. She studied the impact of ecological disturbance on predators and prey in Far East Gippsland here in Victoria, and ran our reintroduction project at North Head in Sydney for 4 years, overseeing the reintroduction of all 3 small native mammal species to the headland. More recently, Dr. Anson has taken on national oversight of AWC's conservation translocation program, which, as we'll hear, is the largest and most ambitious of its kind in Australia. Jen, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks, Joey. It's really great to be here today.
I wanted to start with one of the memorable experiences that you've had in your current role overseeing translocations around the country. Is there anything that stands out as a highlight in this work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there've been so many, so it is hard to choose, but I think one of the most memorable for me was actually the central rock rat. So this is a species that's critically endangered. It's now only found in the West MacDonnell Ranges in the Northern Territory. And we were conducting a translocation to New Haven, to our fenced reserve there. But as these animals, they live in the ranges. And so we had to transfer all the animals from the source site to the release site, and all had to be done by helicopter. Central rock rats are nocturnal, and so we're releasing them at night. So we hiked up to the top of a range. We had to clear space at the top of this range for the chopper to be able to land. Then the chopper came into land. We took the animals out in their little pet packs to unload them. And then we waited until nightfall, carried the rock rats across the range to their release sites, and they're now breeding and really thriving at New Haven. So it was amazing to be part of establishing, that's just the second population for that species. And they're also really beautiful and inquisitive, as well as being highly endangered. So it was fantastic to be part of.
Always good to start with a rat. And like you said, this is a species that has been considered extinct in the past. There's been times where they weren't detected at all in the West MacDonnell Ranges, but thankfully some persisted, and now we've got this secure population at New Haven spreading out. So yeah, fantastic. And what a great feeling that must be to be involved, intervening in a way that literally could save that species from extinction. To zoom out a bit, I'd like to just have a quick chat about why we need to carry out these wildlife translocations. So what are the main objectives of this program for us?
Well, I guess there are three main things that we look at, and the three main drivers for why we're doing our translocations. And the first one, as Tim mentioned and you alluded to as well, is we really need to stop threatened species from going extinct. So since European colonisation, we've had 34 mammal species that have gone extinct, and the majority of them are because of fox and cats. So foxes and cats are a really pervasive threat across Australia. So for some species, these safe havens are really the only realistic prospect to maintain large populations for them. And another reason to do translocations is also to boost the adaptive potential for species to be able to survive into the future, especially as our climate really starts to change and have impacts on these species. So many species are really now restricted to very small parts of their historical ranges. And by restoring the species as part of this reintroduction program, we can put them back into parts of their former range and help build resilience in the species to different environmental conditions. And this is really important, especially with climate change and other threats that are acting on them. And then if you want me to keep going, Joey.
Yeah, sure. What's the third? Yeah.
I think Tim and both you alluded to it as well, but it's also restoring those ecological processes and rebuilding biodiversity at these sites. So some of the species that we've lost, whether they've gone locally extinct or globally extinct, are really ones that are very ecologically important. And often it's not just one species that's been lost from an ecosystem, but it's actually a suite of small mammals that have been lost from that ecosystem. And these mammals have got really important roles: digging, seed and spore dispersal, all these different things that are really critical to maintaining these healthy, functional landscapes. So by restoring the species, we not only put the species back, but we also put these ecological functions back that go on to restore and help and benefit that whole landscape as well.
I think that's one that can easily get overlooked. You know, we get very focused on stopping populations getting down to zero when things go extinct. But we sometimes overlook the role that these animals play in the ecosystems. They're all, you know, prey for different species. They're digging, they're moving around the landscape, having interactions with other parts of the ecosystem. And really that's a gap. That's, you know, there are gaps in these ecosystems where species are missing. So restoring that is also such a critical part of this. We've already boasted about the scale of this program. Can you just outline how many sites, how many species, just what's involved across the country in this translocation effort?
Yeah, sure, Joe. So there's 24 mammal species that are currently involved in the program. That's across 11 different conservation areas, all across Australia except for Victoria and Tasmania. And we even have Foray Island, which is an offshore island in Western Australia that we've completely eradicated foxes and cats from as well. And of the 24 species that we've translocated and established populations for, several of them, we've established more than one population, so we have multiple populations. And this means we can manage them as meta-populations, which is really beneficial to how we can help these species. And as well as that, it also means that we can use them as sources for future translocations to establish new populations without continually to take animals from remnant wild populations.
So that word meta population, what does that mean in practice?
Means that we have the ability to manage not just one population, but a whole subset of different populations, which means we can boost genetics, move animals around as we need to, assist other programs, assist conservation programs in the wild or with other organisations. So it just gives us a lot more potential to be able to assist the species recovery.
Yep. Yeah, great. One translocation that we celebrated a lot last year was that of the northern bettong, a beautiful, small, sort of relative of the kangaroos. You might have seen photos of bettongs. I know everyone on the call gets Wildlife Matters, and we've focused on this species several times over the last few years. And that's because it was in really a critical situation with wild populations dwindling. The populations had gone from 4 sites in the wild down to 2 over the last 10 to 20 years. And both of the 2 remaining populations are still under ongoing threat from feral predators, feral herbivores. Pigs is one that, you know, is a big disturbance up in North Queensland, as well as changes to the structure of the habitat. This is a little bettong that relies on open, grassy understory in eucalypt forests. If anyone has been lucky enough to visit Mount Zero, you'll know the sort of country that I'm talking about on the western fringe of the wet tropics rainforests. And it's really been more than a decade's work to prepare the habitat at Mount Zero Taravale for this translocation of northern bettongs back to the site. We know they were there historically, and that's involved a lot of work with clearing thick understory that has thickened up because of a lack of fire, reintroducing fire into the landscape. And that's one that, you know, quite often we talk about backburning or reducing the risk of big hot wildfires. In this case, it's fire as a very positive process that maintains that open grassy structure in those eucalypt forests. And AWC's been working on increasing the frequency, but, you know, low intensity of fires in that wet sclerophyll forest to get it just right for these fussy little northern bettongs. So, Jen, what's the situation today for this species in the wild at those 2 sites?
Yeah, the situation in the wild is still looking a bit dire, so it's really important that we have that third Mount Zero Taravale population. They're critically endangered, and as you said, there's only those 2 sites left. One of those is the stronghold for this species. So in the Lamb Range, where the majority of all the bettongs are, the northern bettongs are, there's about 1,400 individuals. So that's the main population for this. Excuse me. There's also a second population at Mount Spurgeon, also in that wet tropics area, but this is really nearing extinction. So there's potentially only about 10 to 15 animals left in that population. We've been monitoring that population quite closely in conjunction with both Queensland Parks and traditional owners and ranger groups. And while we've been monitoring that population, there's been a massive decline over the last 5 years. So it's really critical at the moment.
You said 10 to 15 individuals in one of those sites, one of those populations. So that really is on the precipice of extinction. It's very conceivable that that population could die out in coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. That the team's actually just been there in the last few weeks, monitoring that population, and they're the most recent figures that we've got. So it is very concerning.
Wow. What have been some of the unique challenges of working with this species in North Queensland? I know that most of our translocations happen in the arid zone, where we've got mostly large, flat, sandy properties where it's, I imagine, sort of easier to build a fence and move animals around. What about in the wet tropics? What's the challenges presented up there?
Yeah, I think no translocation is easy, Joe. I'm not sure I was
Sure.
going to use that word, but
Easy
I do agree that we've had some complex challenges with this one. So this is the first translocation that we've done to this region of Australia. So the wet tropics in Queensland is a difficult area to work in. The fenced area is a lot smaller than some of our other fenced areas. It's about 1,100 hectares. Some of our other sites might be up to 8,000 hectares, but it's the right size for this species. But it's been incredibly logistically complex, even though it's a much smaller site. So the terrain up there is very challenging, big hills and ravines. There's a lot of creek crossings that the fence has to go through. There's intense weather conditions in that part of Australia, and really tall trees in that forest. So there's a lot that has to go into building of the fence and making sure that it can stay feral predator free. And the other second consideration, I guess, in working in this area is because that source population is so small, we really had to have a really good understanding of how that population was going, to really carefully monitor it, to understand what drivers were there, so that we weren't going to impact on that population with our translocation as well.
It's a pretty bold intervention when numbers are so low in the wild to say, yep, we're going to go and get some and put them in this site that we're confident now is appropriate habitat. Based on our experience with other species of bettongs, do we expect them to do well? How confident are we of this move of putting them
Yeah.
into a feral predator-free environment?
I think for a species like this, I think it's the only thing you can do if you want this species to survive. And with bettongs, we feel very confident that this is a really good thing for this species. So we worked with two other bettong species quite extensively, so the brush-tailed bettong and the burrowing bettong. We've done a number of translocations with both of those species. They've gone really well. We know that they respond very well to predator exclusion fencing. So when you take out the cats and foxes, bettongs do well. They're really susceptible to predation by them. The other thing is that if we take away those threats, we're fairly confident they're going to breed like bettongs. We also say breed like bilbies. It's a thing that they do. So these species can breed all year round, and they can have multiple young each year, which means that they can build up the populations quite quickly if they don't have those threats acting on them. And the other thing is that they're really important in these feral predator-free areas because they are really important ecosystem engineers. So bettongs can really actively modify environments with their diggings. And the diggings can do all sorts of things. We might just think about just digging over the soil, but actually what it does is it assists leaf decomposition, it can reduce fuel loads, improve water infiltration into the soil, and it can assist seed germination. So there's a bunch of different things that come from just this digging action. And the northern bettong in particular also really rely heavily on truffles as a main part of their diet. And so they're really also important dispersers of fungal spores, and that can really assist ecosystem health as well. And so we think that they're going to do really well, both for the species and also for the environment that they're in.
A sophisticated palate, little bettongs, truffles.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So this release actually happened last year in 2023. We're almost 12 months on now, and I know that some of the team has been up there doing surveys last week and this week at Mount Zero Taraval. What have they seen? Is there evidence that they're doing well?
Yeah, so the team's still out at the moment. So stay tuned for the full results. But so far from what we've seen over the last year and over the last week, they're doing great. So all the animals that we're catching are in really good body condition. They're really healthy. Animals have got pouch young, and we're also seeing young at foot. So that's independent juveniles, subadults running around and foraging on those truffles that they love. And so we're both getting both breeding and recruitment into that population, and that is a real key to seeing how that population will establish. So we think all signs are pointing in a really good direction.
How good. I've got a photo that one of the team up there sent me of a baby northern bettong. So this is one that would have been born presumably at Mount Zero Taraval since the reintroduction. So, that's pretty cool too, to see these, not just surviving, the individuals that we translocated, but, new young being born, growing up in the pouch, and then recruiting to the population and helping to grow that population at Mount Zero Taraval.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And we actually think they're up to the 3rd generation. So the young have now had young in some cases.
Okay, so that's our first example, the northern bettong, one which is approaching extinction in the wild with just 2 populations left. And we've been able to establish this 3rd population, which is currently meeting all the criteria for success at Mount Zero Taraval. Again, standing in between extinction and, in between the northern bettong and extinction. The second case study I'd like to talk about is the Golden Bandicoot. And this is taking us to a different corner of the country. Like several other small native mammals, this is a species that was widespread across Central Australia, Western deserts, and up into the Kimberley. So a range sort of taking in that northwest quarter of the continent, I suppose. And AWC is in this unique position with a big on-ground presence in Central Australia, our project at Newhaven, but also with our work in the Kimberley at Charnley River Artesian Range and our partnership sites up there. And that's part of the Bandicoot's last wild mainland refuge. So it's pretty special to have an organisation that can access both the last remaining populations and also the site where we're hoping to reintroduce them. The project with Golden Bandicoots has been very collaborative with ranger groups, both in the Kimberley and in Central Australia, helping to monitor, trap, and release translocated bandicoots. Jen, can you talk us through some of the incredible logistics involved in moving these animals interstate from the Kimberley to Newhaven, and also from the second source site? We'll come to that later.
Yeah. So as you said, so the Kimberley is really one of those last remaining strongholds for the species on the mainland. It's really genetically diverse, so it was very important for us to have these animals represented in the Newhaven population. But we didn't actually know how many animals were there. So the team, before we even did the translocation, the team went out and conducted a population estimate, and that's never been attempted in the Kimberley. So this was a really new thing. The Artesian Range, which is the part of the Kimberley where we have this population, it's a really remote part of the Kimberley. There's no road access. And so to do both the population estimate and the sourcing, it all had to be done by chopper. So animals were trapped, they were put on the helicopters back to the base, the animals were processed, then they were chopped out of the Artesian Range on a helicopter to be put on a small plane to be then flown to Newhaven. So it was, a lot of logistics that went into this to get those animals out safely and into Newhaven.
A lot of different modes of travel for a small marsupial.
Very, very spoiled little animals.
The other thing that I was just thinking about as you're talking about it was just the difference in the landscape between a place like Artesian Range, which is very rugged, dissected sandstone with gorges, savanna forest, monsoon climate, so big wet season, and 6 or 7 months with no rain at all. That's very different to Central Australia, to sandy deserts at Newhaven, red sand, where yes, they've had some rain recently, but it can be very, very dry. How do we know that the bandicoots from the Kimberley will be able to adjust to the new climate that they find themselves in?
Yeah, so I guess this is about increasing the adaptive potential of this species. So they are an arid adapted species. And what we've done is, because the Kimberley genetics are so diverse, we know that there are genes in there that we want to be able to maintain for this new population. So there's high allelic richness, and there's really low levels of relatedness in this population. And with the Barrow Island population, which is that second population, we had moderate genetic diversity, but it's a very large population. So with these reintroductions, you want to have healthy individuals, you want to have good genetic diversity if possible, and you want to have a robust number of founders. And so this allows us to facilitate population growth without swamping those Kimberley genetics, to make sure that we get adaptive capacity in that new population.
So that the second source was Barrow Island, which is an island off the coast of Western Australia. There's a big gas facility on the island, but it's also really important for small mammals, as are a number of those West Australian islands.
That's right.
I found an interesting tidbit from the population there. Apparently there are, perhaps one of the reasons there are so many golden bandicoots is that they are actually one of the scavengers that preys on turtle eggs. So there are flatback turtles that nest on Barrow Island, and golden bandicoots are out there digging up and eating turtle eggs. So I assume they'll miss the turtle eggs at New Haven. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting to share. Yeah, that's a great example of a species which has declined at a continental scale, and being able to restore it into those different climatic conditions to help it adjust and help it, hopefully sort of future-proof that species and those populations by providing that diversity of conditions to help it evolve and adapt. Again, we've now passed more than 12 months since the golden bandicoots were released at New Haven, and we're starting to see some very exciting pictures come in from there. This is a couple of young golden bandicoots that were trapped in surveys recently. So they're spreading out throughout that 9,500 hectare safe haven. We might actually address this now. There's a question in the chat about whether populations, whether there's a risk of overpopulation within the fenced safe havens where we're putting these animals into. Is that a concern, and how might we mitigate that?
We look at overpopulation for all of our translocation program. It's a consideration as part of our planning as we do a translocation. For a lot of these, you would have to get to very large numbers before you're concerned about overpopulation, both because of the size of the area and also because of the density that these species can live at. So they can live at quite high densities. We also make sure that there's still native predators in these systems. So often we've got avian predators, we've got goannas, and we also have animals that can actually get out of the fence sometimes if they want to. So there's a number of reasons why we're very confident that we won't get overpopulation in these species. And these are also, a lot of the arid areas are kind of boom bust. So these species are really being able to adapt to have very large populations that crash down and then come back up again. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's hard to get your head around unless you've been out to one of these sites is the scale of these safe havens. So, the fence at New Haven, it's something like 40 kilometers perimeter. It's not like a small fenced, breeding facility or anything like that. It's like a big chunk of desert that is protected from cats and foxes. So there are still whistling kites and grey falcons and wedge-tailed eagles and, like you said, goannas, which will certainly make a meal of some of these reintroduced mammals if given the chance. That's part of it. So that's, restoring those food chains, which is how these animals would have lived, until they were wiped out from the desert by cats and foxes. So it's really just removing those feral predators. But, the rest of the predators probably very happy to see our reintroduction program succeed.
Yes, absolutely.
This translocation program has, it's getting more and more busy. And I think we've had, dozens over the last couple of years of operations, certainly. And even last week, our most recent translocation, which was a little different to the ones I've talked about, where we're establishing new populations, so golden bandicoots and northern bettongs. This is one where we were supplementing an existing population of a mammal at Scotia. Can you tell us what the most recent translocation was and how it went?
Yeah, so this species is amazing because it was thought to be extinct, and it was actually rediscovered in 1973, and there was one population left. At Scotia, that population our population at Scotia has been there for about 20 years. We've established that. But about 5 years ago, the population experienced really extreme drought conditions, and we had a really large population reduction. With population reductions, you can also get a genetic bottleneck. And so it's really important to supplement those individuals and get some more genetics into that population. So we did a translocation where we actually took 2 lots of animals, and some of those animals were going to Scotia to increase the genetic diversity in that site, and also some animals were going to Mallee Cliffs to establish a new population there, as well as our third population at the Pilliga.
I'll just jump in. I think I forgot to mention Bridled Nailtail Wallaby is the species we're talking about. I'm sure people guessed it from the photo, and they'll be familiar with this beautiful little wallaby. Always a bit smaller than you think when you see them in real life. They're quite short.
Yeah, they're about 4 kilos. So
wow. Yeah.
Not that big. Yeah.
Beautiful markings. They're a group that has seen extinction. So this species, like you said, was thought to be extinct. Its close relative, the crescent nailtail wallaby, was wiped out completely and was just one of the most beautiful kangaroo wallaby members of that family. So great that we're intervening to stop the same fate occurring to bridled nailtail wallabies. So you mentioned there's the risk of a genetic bottleneck when populations get too small, and that we've recognised that risk at Scotia and intervened. Yeah. Can you talk about how we're now managing multiple populations and what sort of interventions might we need to make sure they're resilient and healthy into the future?
Yeah, so because we have those 3 meta populations, we can move animals around. We can increase the genetics that are going into those populations. And as we talked about before, this is a boom bust species. So they're very arid adapted, this species, but the more resilience and adaptive capacity we can build into all these different meta populations, they're all in different environmental conditions, which means those genes will act in slightly different ways. Means that we can safeguard the species from extinction. We can also increase the genetic diversity of them, and we can establish new populations. So by building these meta populations and manage them as not just one single remaining population, but 3 or now 4 populations, we can really help the species a lot better.
I've been thinking about, rather than just seeing our work as stopping things going extinct, we actually want to see bandicoots everywhere. We want wallabies everywhere. We want all of these small and medium-sized mammals back in the landscapes where they belong. And I think from the examples that we've been chatting about, Jen, that's really the trajectory that we're on. AWC is rebuilding populations of some of these most threatened mammal species. And these sanctuaries are filling up with animals again. It's just so rewarding to see.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's so exciting, this program.
Thank you for sharing those recent updates with us about the translocation program around the country. It's been a terrific chat. We did have some questions come in. I think we've addressed most of them. There's one that I'll just bring up if we've got a minute about beyond safe havens. So outside of these fenced areas, what's the scope for establishing populations at a broader scale in an unfenced landscape? Is that something that we can actively explore?
It is something we're actively exploring, Joey. It's actually something that we've started to do. We do recognise that safe havens are critically important to being able to keep these species, but no one wants to see the whole of Australia fenced, so it's not viable. It's not something that we can do. There are some species that we can assist with beyond the fence translocations. I guess a big caveat of that is that there are some species that can't persist with any foxes and cats in that environment. As soon as they go beyond the fence, they just get decimated. But there are some species that will have a little bit of resilience if we do it carefully and really well managed. And part of that management is really intensive feral predator control outside the fenced areas. So the first 2 programs that we've been doing is actually at Mount Gibson in Western Australia. We started with the brush-tailed possum, and we did this experimentally. So we did half of the translocation inside the fence with the brush-tailed possum and half outside the fence on top of that layer of feral predator control to really track how they were going. And we had really great survival. Those possums really flourished. And so on the back of that, we then went and translocated western quolls outside the fence. And again, really carefully monitor them, had a lot of intensive feral predator control to see how they're going. And we're working on that in other sanctuaries, but there will be some species that we just won't be able to do that with. But where we can, we're very, very keen to learn as much as we can and find ways to get these animals back into those broader landscapes.
Very exciting work. Jen, thank you for taking the time and sharing that with us.
Thanks, Joey.
I'll hand back to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you so much, Joey, and thank you so much, Jen. Also, a nod to you in the audience who did submit some questions. We'd be very happy to follow up. Hopefully those web links will give you a little taste of the information. But the questions are really important, and they really do go to the heart of the programme, which is that AWC is absolutely required to deliver conservation at scale. It has to occur inside the fence and beyond those fenced boundaries if we are to be effective. I really hope that today has just given you a taste of how effective this programme is and has done what we said we would do, which is try to shine a light on the impact of your support on wildlife and habitat across Australia. All of us are happy to take questions anytime. I hope you by now know, at least Tim and myself, our email addresses. I'm delighted to say that if you haven't had it in your inbox already today, there will be a feature from Tim coming on that Bridled Nailtail Wallaby release. So there'll be some really great information coming to you around that. So look, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for your support of AWC. If you haven't already this year, please can I encourage you to consider a donation to AWC. We really cannot do this work without you. We do not rely on government or contract funding. The majority of our work is funded through your investment. So I encourage you to consider that. Look, I'm just at the risk of getting ahead of myself. There is something exciting to share with you, which is that on Friday, we're going to launch a dollar matching appeal. In other words, 10 AWC supporters have come forward and they have agreed to match all gifts raised between the 14th and the 30th of June up to a target of $2 million collectively. It sounds a lot, but this program is worth every dollar, and every dollar counts. Thank you so much for your support of AWC. Thanks on behalf of us all for joining us today. And yes, let's continue to stand together between Australian wildlife and the threat of extinction. Thank you again.